We're done. Oh, that takes me back. Yeah. It's Stalingrad. I did that a few years ago, but... What? They're saying it's as bloody as those battles, but... 70,000 in 2 weeks? That's... Yeah, well, that's tabloids for you, I suppose, huh? Yeah, all right. Yeah. February 11th, 1951. Last year, at their darkest hour, the UN forces completely turned the tide of this war at a battle of Inchon. Well, the war looks different here in 1951, but can another battle at Inchon do it again? And if so, for whom? I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, Chinese units began entering U.S. 10th Corps sector in the central corridor of Korea. And in the west, the UN forces advanced on the Han River south of Seoul. And this week, those UN forces moving up the west coast reached their objectives. Okay, at the start of this week, yet another Chinese division pops up south of the Han, on the right of the advancing UN troops. This is the 114th Division of the PVA 38th Army, joining the 112th and 113th Divisions of the same army already in the sector, and bringing the total divisions opposing U.S. 1st and 9th Corps up to 7. Interrogation of POWs also sheds light on the Chinese tactics. Supposedly, here in the West, People's Volunteer Army Commander Peng Dehuai is seeking to stall the UN push for as long as possible. So he spread out his troops along a broad front and instructed them to defend in depth, with each little pocket fighting with the UN troops until American artillery and air power starts to pound them and then pulling back. It seems the PVA is abuzz with rumors of a new offensive. So say the captives the UN forces speak to this week. This basically matches what 8th Army Commander Matt Ridgway thinks. He's sure a Chinese counterattack is coming, and this merely confirms it. He's also fairly certain he knows where that offensive is going to come: Korea's central corridor, where Ned Almond's 10th Corps is currently on the move. There are multiple reasons for thinking this. One, it's a lot hillier and rougher there than it is in the West, perfect ground for how the PVA likes to attack. 2, there's the reported massing of Chinese troops in the sector north of Chipyong-ni. 3, the fact that the Chinese are not really defending the Han River line with full conviction. Okay, we've seen how difficult UN air power can make it for the Chinese to cross rivers in large numbers. So if their target was in the western sector, surely they'd fight Ridgway's advancing forces with all they've got and keep them away from the river to make that crossing as easy as possible. The last thing the Chinese would want is for UN troops to push all the way to the river line and then be forced to fight across it in the first hours of their attack. So taken all together, Ridgway thinks it could only be Almond's 10th Corps the Chinese have their sights set on. So that's a concern. But it's a concern for a few days from now. For now, this makes Ridgway feel he can attack freely in the western sector. So it's full steam ahead for Operation Thunderbolt. American tanks backed by infantry battalions leap ahead, seeking out concentrations of communist troops to force a withdrawal, saving the main line the trouble of clearing them out, and hopefully speeding up the advance. By the 9th, the forward elements of these armored spearheads are in sight of the city of Inchon. The situation here is a little nebulous, though, because while Chinese troops in U.S. 1st Corps zone are gradually retreating north across the Han River, North Korean KPA troops are thought to be still in the area, defending Inchon, Kimpo Airfield, and the heights south of Seoul. This has not been confirmed, and nobody is quite sure where these KPA divisions currently are as of February 8th. So Ridgway and 1st Corps Commander Frank Milburn have devised a plan to sniff them out. Ridgway has asked Admiral Charles Joy to send a task force to the waters off Inchon. This could pull any KPA units west towards the coastline in anticipation of another amphibious landing like in September. So Milburn arranges an independent force of tanks and motorized infantry under Frank Allen to strike north towards Kimpo. Both of these small operations are to go off the 10th. If KPA units are pulled west and vacate Kimpo Airfield, then Task Force Allen may very well cut them off and block their escape route. As it turns out, though, all of this is unnecessary because the KPA are gone. The advance parties of 25th Division see absolutely no enemy presence in Inchon, and the entire sector is pretty quiet. Task Force Allen's advance goes ahead with little resistance, just a little small arms fire, and they seize the Kimpo area by the end of the week. The decoy invasion fleet stands down, and the UN troops just walk into Inchon instead. By today, the 11th, there is no serious resistance remaining south of the Han River on the left or the center of the Thunderbolt advance. The only places the communist forces are refusing to pull back is on the right at the junction of 9th Corps and 10th Corps. Ridgway thinks this enemy force is clearly a screening force protecting the flank of Chinese armies preparing to attack 10th Corps. Actually, Almond's 10th Corps offensive gets underway this week on the 5th. This is Operation Roundup, aiming towards the crossroads on the Hongchon River to the city of Hongchon. Resistance here over the first few days is not any worse than it is in the west, but their terrain is much tougher. It's hilly, bordering on mountainous, with the only roads really suitable for vehicles and marching set in the valleys between the heights. UN troops obviously aren't going to find and hit enemy positions here as easily as they do in the west. And so the firefights are all a bit more chaotic, a bit more close range, and occasionally bring UN units to a complete stop while they assess what they're fighting against. Within a couple of days, though, 10th Corps and South Korean ROK 3rd Corps have occupied the lands north of Pyeongchang and Hwangseong, which were the staging grounds of that KPA offensive we saw a couple weeks back. Almond asked to be given the ROK 3rd Division, currently serving as ROK 3rd Corps Reserve, to assist in the drive on Hongchon. He gets it, and ROK 3rd moves up to join ROK 5th and 8th Divisions in the lead. After 3 days, Almond perceived that the attack on Hongchon was as much a battle against terrain as against enemy opposition. Resistance did stiffen after an easy opening day, but the defending forces stayed to the tops of hills and allowed the South Koreans to bring down heavy artillery concentrations and to maneuver around them. The ROK assault forces, in Almond's estimation, had gained confidence over the 3 days, substantially from the presence and support of the American artillery and tanks. As of the 8th, the success of the advance thus appeared largely to depend on overcoming terrain limitations on infantry maneuver, tank movement, and artillery forward displacement. If this all seems like it's going a little too smoothly, that's only because it is. On the 7th, ROK 5th Division encounters a North Korean force of around 4,000 troops. They plan an attack, but the North Koreans attack first. Throughout the 8th and 9th, ROK 5th is hit hard, completely shutting down progress and forcing them back. But then the KPA suddenly abandon the attack and head northwest. It's like the ROK troops had disturbed a hornet's nest more than a real battle. Their foe came at them with all they had and then just walked off. The UN advance continues, but by the end of this week, the operation is still some way short of Hongchon, and Ridgway is getting antsy about what's developing to Almond's northwest, what with Chinese armies gathering, and now the KPA remnants heading that way. Maybe the Chinese are about to attack. Today, the 11th, Ridgway tells Almond to stop advancing in his western sector, at least until the Chinese bridgehead holding up 9th Corps west of it has been taken care of. The last thing he wants right now is for Almond to overextend any forces. Colonel Robert G. Ferguson, the acting G2, told Ridgway that the long lull was purely the consequence of Chinese resupply, transportation, and reinforcement difficulties. The slogan repeatedly given in statements by Chinese government officials continued to be to drive UNC forces out of Korea. Ferguson predicted that once the logistical problems were sufficiently relieved, and that time appeared to be near, the campaign to push the United Nations command off the peninsula would be resumed with full acceptance of any further heavy personnel losses and supply problems that might occur. So that is where the UN forces stand at the end of the week. Thunderbolt has basically achieved its objectives, save for that Chinese bridgehead. Roundup has pushed Almond's forces up in line with Ridgway's own advance, and here they wait. The next move belongs to Peng Dehuai. But how successful have UN troops actually been on the ground throughout this push? Well, successful enough to keep the arguments between UN Forces Commander Douglas MacArthur and Washington, D.C. to a minimum. There's been a lull in the action there, accompanying the lull on the Korean ground through most of January. However, by the end of this week, disagreements threatened to rear their heads once more. It seems Western military and political men are already thinking about what to do once they again reach the 38th parallel. The ongoing offensive, which has carried 8th Army to the Han River and put the Chinese to flight, causes more complications in Washington. There are differences of opinion on whether to push beyond the 38th parallel. However, the powers that be, including the Pentagon and the State Department, are in agreement with the British and French that the strategy should be to halt at the 38th parallel and negotiate with the communists to terminate the war. In contrast, General MacArthur believes it necessary to continue the attack, and he is adamantly opposed to the UN policy of giving the communists a free, untouchable sanctuary in Manchuria. Flight is a strong word for what the Chinese are doing. We know that they're preparing for a battle, not fleeing from one. But one wouldn't really know that from reading the after-action reports from 8th Army. Here's the thing. All along the line, UN units have been reporting light to moderate resistance, yet are still estimating Chinese casualties in the thousands, not the hundreds or the dozens. MacArthur's headquarters estimates around 135,000 Chinese casualties since mid-October, and nearly 70,000 of those in just the past 2 weeks of advance alone. 70,000 in 2 weeks. Of course, UN command knows the Chinese are suffering, but their casualty estimates, their recent daily death tolls for Operation Thunderbolt alone, place it up there with the bad days of battles like Stalingrad or Verdun, somewhere in the ballpark of 5,000 plus casualties per day. As Isidore Stone remarks in The Hidden History of the Korean War, though the enemy was difficult to find, he was being slaughtered in astronomical numbers. But nobody wants to be a downer and cast doubt on these extravagant claims, so they pass from the battlefield to the tabloid press without much scrutiny. But could they actually be accurate? Well, perhaps we'll find out next week, for this week of the war is over. Ridgway has managed to achieve his initial objectives, and his thorough and cautious offensive has brought his forces up to the positions he wants. Inchon and Kimpo Airfield are back under UN control, and with the Han River at U.S. First Corps' front, they should be able to hold that line. But that, of course, is also contingent on the performance of Ned Almond's 10th Corps and ROK 3rd Corps. Remember, just a few weeks ago, the UN forces weren't defeated in Seoul itself, but had to give it up because of the threat of encirclement. Could this happen again? Or could the stakes for this next offensive be even greater than that? For Matt Ridgway and Peng Dehuai are already both convinced. This is it. These are the days that will determine the future of the Korean Peninsula. Ridgway already knows that large-scale reinforcements are out of the question. So if he loses what he has in the upcoming battle, it won't be getting replaced. Peng knows that his PVA armies can't stay here, not in the long term, not while American air power starves them. Both sides desperately need a win, and a decisive one might propel either side to victory. So Robert Ferguson, acting G2, gives Ridgway his final predictions. The Chinese 13th Army Group is in position. The KPA forces are supporting them. The Chinese 9th Army Group is moving south from Wonsan. Once that arrives, all hell will break loose. That gives them no more than 4 or 5 days to prepare. There's only one problem. Peng does not wait for the 9th Army Group. He attacks tonight, the 11th, and as we reach midnight, his forces have already broken through.